What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing the bizarre unsolved death of Cindy James. I'm trying to find the right balance here on this channel between discussing true crime with you all and then sticking to what I know best and talking about the paranormal. Sometimes, when I'm lucky, those two things blend together in a frightful mix of reality and the paranormal. And then there are sometimes, like with this case I want to bring to you all today, there's no need for a paranormal element because everything is just so bizarre as it is already. I absolutely believe that sometimes certain people just seem to draw the mysterious to them. People like me and like many of you all watching this video right now, but sometimes as well, people tend to draw high strangeness in the form of attracting the wrong type of person to them without even understanding why or knowing that they did it at all. I've had more than several scary run-ins with presumed psychos and with stalkers throughout my life. And I'll tell you right now, I would rather deal with the paranormal instead of human beings all day long and any day of the week. And that's the truth. This case, though, it really got to me because of all of the rumor and speculation that's still floating around out there about it and the fact that it's never been solved. With that being said, I thought that maybe I could at least try to do what I think I do best and set the record at least a little straighter, or at least give my educated opinion about the bizarre twisting and turning mystery this case has somehow become. Let's take a look at the Phantom Stalker and what in the world happened to Cindy James. Let's jump right in. Cindy James was living a seemingly perfectly normal life in Richmond, British Columbia, Canada. Her husband was a wealthy and well-known psychiatrist named Dr. Roy Makepeace, and Cindy herself was a professional woman. She worked as an administrator at a preschool where the children had behavioral and emotional issues. She was happy, at peace. She was content until she wasn't any of those things anymore, when things really began to go downhill and she seemingly started to spiral sometime in 1982. Most people say it started when Cindy and Roy separated, but whatever started it, Cindy's life soon became out of control, and with everything going on, no one could have ever predicted that she would become the subject of one of the most baffling and bizarre unsolved mysteries and strange deaths Canada has ever seen. It was about 4 months after she and her husband had separated that Cindy started being almost constantly harassed by bizarre phone calls. So that's what started it all off. The relentless calls were all different in many ways, but they were always unwelcomed and harassing in nature. Whether the person on the other end of the line was whispering in Cindy's ear, shouting threats and obscenities, or just leaving the smothering silence on the other end of the line to speak for itself, it terrified poor Cindy and kept her almost constantly on edge, especially every time the phone rang. So, back in the early 1980s, we didn't have cell phones, and we certainly didn't have caller ID. As a matter of fact, give me a show of hands in the comments if any of you ever remember your parents making you answer the phone just so you could tell whoever it ended up being on the other end of the line that they weren't home, but that you would take a message, all while you sat there uncomfortably repeating everything the caller said out loud for your mom or your dad who were standing right there to hear. It's like, that could be a bill collector. Go answer it and tell them I'm not home. You had no idea who was calling. I'm just saying, it's unimaginable for people these days who have never lived in that time to understand that there was a time when your phone would ring and it would only ring in your home and you would have absolutely no idea who was on the other end of the line. Cindy never recognized the voice on the other end of the line, and she begged whoever it was to please just leave her alone. However, the opposite happened, and the more she persisted in her resistance, the calls actually increased in their frequency and became more and more sinister and violent as the days and the weeks wore on. These phone calls came at all hours of the day and night, and Cindy was no longer able to sleep well or to really rest at all because of the incessant ringing of the phone. There was no blocking the number or anything like that with a landline phone. Again, it isn't like today, and while I guess she could have taken the phone off the hook, she was a professional woman who probably couldn't afford to have her phone off the hook all day long, every single day, leaving no one having any access to her. The only thing she felt she could do at the time was to just kind of deal with it and hope and pray that it would eventually stop. But it didn't stop, and it continued to get progressively worse. Cindy felt like she was being tortured mentally, and because of how utterly exhausted she was, she also felt like she was in a state of constant limbo. She was never able to fully relax, even when the phone wasn't ringing, because she was always hyper aware of the fact that it could ring at any moment. And also, the threats the person on the other end of the line were making were really terrifying. She just didn't know what to do. After receiving hundreds of these calls day in and day out for months, she finally told her parents what was going on, and they were finally able to convince her to go to the Vancouver police to see if they would offer her any assistance. Why she didn't get her number changed, I'm not sure. Maybe that wasn't an option for her at that time either. I did read some reports that she changed her number several times, and the caller kept getting her number and just calling her anyway. And I'm pretty sure that is what happened, but I couldn't factually verify it. The authorities really couldn't do much, and they actually weren't even able to figure out who was making the calls in the first place or where the calls were originating from. The authorities did question those closest to Cindy, but everyone she knew, from her family members to close friends, and even those she worked with, not a single person had a bad or negative thing to say about her, and no one knew about any enemies she might have had. She was a good person and had no known enemies to begin with, so the authorities were at a dead end almost immediately in their precursory investigation. They checked her background to see if she had ever been involved in anything illegal, but her lifestyle was not one of someone who would be considered at risk for anything like this. Unfortunately for Cindy James, this was only the beginning. It seemed like the only thing she had accomplished by getting the police involved was making the stalker more angry. The calls increased considerably after that, and the threats became more terrifying and more menacing than ever before. Now, not only was she receiving hundreds of bizarre and terrifying, threatening phone calls, but she was also finding anonymous letters in front of her home's front door, left right there on the doorstep to be sure she didn't miss them. Her porch lights were smashed out on several occasions, and she would constantly hear someone prowling around outside of her house at night. One time she went outside because she heard a strange noise, and she was horrified and sickened to find 3 dead cats hanging in her backyard, in her garden. And on another occasion, when she was so scared she finally decided to call the cops, she found silence on the other end of the receiver as she desperately realized her phone line had been cut. There were so many other incidents that I would literally be here all day naming them, but let me tell you about a few more. One time Cindy received a delivery of an order of red meat, obviously that she hadn't purchased. She went outside and saw a picture of a real dead body from a morgue sitting in her car's windshield, and she even found her dog, terrified and scared out of its mind, with a cord so tightly wrapped around its neck that there was no doubt someone had tried to strangle the poor dog. Throughout all of those incidents and so many more, the phone calls to Cindy's home continued, and also they continued to escalate in their violence and malevolence. Cindy was constantly terrified and paranoid, just waiting for the next phone call or the next violent and sickening act that would be carried out towards her, either directly or in some roundabout way, like what was done with her dog. Cindy told her good friend, a woman named Agnes Woodcock, that she knew someone was out to get her and to harm her. She just couldn't figure out who it was. When interviewed later on, Agnes stated, quote, "She told me many times that he wanted to scare her to death. She said, quote, he doesn't want to kill me, he wants to scare me to death," end quote. While it wasn't clear who the he Cindy mentioned was, it can be assumed, I think, that she meant the man on the phone, the harasser, the phantom stalker. Most people who knew about it made a connection between the phone calls and all of the other heinous acts, and it was almost surely all being done and orchestrated by the same person, the man on the other end of the line. Things definitely came to a head one day when Agnes paid a random visit to Cindy. Knowing what was going on, she was obviously very concerned for her friend and wanted to check on her and make sure she was at least okay. I guess she hadn't heard from her in a couple of days. Agnes said about that visit, quote, "I went up and knocked on the door. There was no answer. I assumed she was having her bath. She did so every night. And I thought I heard something. I wasn't sure what it was. I found her crouched down with a nylon tied tightly around her neck. Cindy said she'd gone out to the garage to get a box and someone grabbed her from behind. All she saw were white sneakers," end quote. Cindy was convinced that the only reason her attacker hadn't strangled her to death right then was because he had heard Agnes and became scared he would get caught in the act and ran off. Obviously, the police were called again, but when they questioned Cindy for whatever reason, they got the distinct impression that she wasn't telling them everything and had been holding back information. Why she would do that is anyone's guess, but the police adamantly believed she was hiding something, and their relationship with Cindy James would only get worse from there. Because of the strange feelings they got about that particular incident from Cindy, the authorities started to believe that maybe Cindy had staged the entire incident herself, and after that thought occurred to them, they started to think that maybe she had been making the entire thing up. They thought she had orchestrated everything else she had reported had happened to her, including the phone calls, all of these months leading up to this attack. To their credit, the authorities did always try to find out what was going on, and they took fingerprints and collected evidence they felt was pertinent at the time, at least in the beginning. However, they were never able to find any foreign fingerprints, and Cindy herself failed a lie detector test, according to the cops involved. They said she actually failed too. I also read some reports from the police that said that they never even saw anything strange, or they never saw any sign of any phantom stalker on any of the surveillance cameras, but I never was able to put together what footage they were talking about. It was 1982. It's not like it is today where we're filmed every 30 seconds at traffic lights. Surveillance was still considered pretty high-tech stuff at the time, and it wasn't like everyone had cell phones, instant access to be able to film a high-quality video and ring doorbells. Then I looked a little deeper and I was like, oh, that makes sense, because I realized that they were talking about an optical observation as was being done by the police department. So they weren't talking about surveillance footage, they were talking about surveillance. One officer that had been assigned to surveil Cindy's home, like basically 24/7, especially in the middle of the night, would later state, quote, they had 24-hour surveillance on her house for days on end with up to 14 officers, but never when surveillance was on her house, never any event would happen. As soon as surveillance was taken off, of course, then she'd get another incident that happened, end quote. But does this mean that she was lying and staging everything, or could it have been that it was just someone who was close to her or connected to someone close to her that would have access to her whereabouts and all of the actions she took as she took them? And they knew when to come around and when not to. Whatever the case might have been, Cindy was scared enough that she even moved out of her house and into a new one, hoping that all of the harassment and the whole terrifying ordeal itself would stop and finally blow over. She had no such luck, though. Cindy also painted her car and changed her last name, but nothing seemed to work, and this phantom stalker seemed even more determined to terrorize Cindy and drive her absolutely insane at this point than ever before. Eventually, she realized that the police thought she was making it all up, and so she knew she could no longer trust them to really help her, so she hired her own private investigator. That investigator's name was Ozzy Caban, and he also believed that Cindy had been holding back information from everyone, but he thought that it was maybe because the attacker had threatened her in some way, like saying he would harm her family or ruin her career, something that would keep her from telling the whole truth, mainly about who he was, or at least her suspicions of who he was. Ozzy gave Cindy a two-way radio in which he stayed in constant contact with her, and sure enough, one night, there was a terrifying incident that involved an unknown intruder. Ozzy Caban described what happened that night by saying, quote, I went around the house and the house was locked. I was able to look into the house through a window and I found Cindy lying there. I took a look at her and I thought she was dead. There was a note that was pinned with a paring knife through her hand. I went to the telephone and called 911 and within about 2 minutes she revived briefly and then they took her to the hospital. She told me that she noticed a man coming through the gate. The next thing that she remembers is being hit on the side of the head with a piece of wood or something in that nature. She then remembered being held down on the floor, and she remembered a needle going into her arm, end quote. So, with as shocking and harrowing as that event had been, you would think that maybe the police would have started taking Cindy a little bit more seriously at that point, right? You'd be wrong. By that point, they had decided she was the culprit of all of the attacks on herself, and they weren't interested in helping her anymore at all. They didn't even bother to investigate that particular attack any further, took no fingerprints or other evidence to try and see if anyone had actually been there in her home. After all, according to them, Ozzy hadn't actually seen an intruder, and he had only managed to show up after the phantom stalker had left Cindy there, seemingly awaiting her death. I tried to find what the note that was paring knifed through her hand said, but I saw about 25 different things. And I can't even begin to imagine which one of those was actually what was said in the note. So I'm sorry, guys, I don't have that information, but I really wish I did, because that might give some sort of a glimpse into the attacker's intentions, or if it was Cindy herself, which I don't really think it is. Not at this point anyway. In the meantime, nothing was slowing down or showing any signs of stopping at all. And in fact, if you can believe it, it was still getting progressively worse. Cindy was found half dazed and lying in a ditch one day, half conscious and 6 miles away from her home, with no idea how she had gotten there or what had happened to her. She had a nylon stocking tied around her neck, and she had been wearing men's work boots and gloves that didn't belong to her or anyone she knew. She also had scratches and bruises all over her body, but once again, the police were convinced it was all an act and refused to even investigate. They didn't even record her statements about that incident. Cindy was obviously and rightfully worried that someone was not only out to get her, but out to really kill her, and she was terrified. She went so far as to ask Agnes and her husband Tom to stay with her in her new home so that she wouldn't have to be alone anymore. I don't know about you all, but if I am, for whatever reason, staging all of these elaborate attacks on myself, I'm certainly not going to hire a private investigator or ask my friend and her husband to come and stay with me. It doesn't make sense, and for as adamant as the police were that this was all Cindy's doing, they never gave any reasoning behind why they thought she would do such a thing, and besides the failed polygraphs, which aren't even admissible in court, why they were so convinced it was her. What I mean is, to what end? What did she have to gain from this? There were some people who thought she was trying to get her husband to come back to her. Like, look at me, I'm so weak, I'm being attacked when you're not around. But if that were the case, wouldn't she have asked her husband to come back into the home and stay in the home with her? It didn't even seem like they were talking at this point, from what I could gather. So like I said, what would her end goal have been in this scenario? I don't get it. And honestly, in my own opinion, I think they simply didn't take stalking very seriously back then. And they didn't know what to do, and therefore were just looking to take the easy way out, victim blame, because their own means of investigating had continuously failed, in this case, time and time again. I always find it funny when I listen to police officers speak and they say, well, he failed the polygraph, so now we know we got him. But then if the suspect passes the polygraph, they almost always say, well, they're inadmissible anyways. They don't mean much. It could still be this person. That's just a side note, something that frustrates me to no end. So anyway, Agnes and her husband Tom did agree to stay with Cindy for a while because they wanted to make sure she was protected and not left alone to whoever this sick maniac was that had been harassing her, so that he can continue and torture and torment and possibly even kill her. They were afraid that she was going to be killed. Cindy James had been through enough, but it wasn't anywhere near over. Even with her friends living in her home, the attacks and harassment continued. One night, Agnes and Tom heard a strange noise coming from the downstairs of the home, and they jumped up and ran downstairs as quickly as possible, fearing that something terrible was being done or had been done to Cindy. When they got downstairs, though, they were shocked to find that the basement had been set on fire and was blazing as they stared down the steps. Tom ran to call 911, but of course the phone lines had been cut and the line was completely dead. Tom swears that when he looked outside, he was trying to figure out if anyone was around and what was going on. He saw a man standing at the curb in front of the house, and when he started running towards the guy, yelling and begging this man to try and help him call for help, the man turned and ran off, disappearing into the night. This incident was also said to have been masterminded and staged by Cindy James herself. One reporter who was there on the scene, named Neil Hall, said, quote, "There was no dust or fingerprints disturbed on the outside of the windowsill. But somebody set the fires from inside the home and would have had to have climbed through that window. Now that should have been one sign. Also, she said she was out walking her dog late at night that night. Now, if somebody was being attacked, why would they go out alone walking their dog 3 o'clock in the morning? Does that make sense?" End quote. Now, I've got to admit here, guys, that Cindy claiming to have been out walking her dog at 3 in the morning when she knew she was being tortured and tormented by some crazy man who more than likely wanted her dead and who had presumably tried to kill her at least twice did sound a little odd to me. It did. Plus, why didn't she tell Tom and Agnes that she was going? They more than likely would have talked her out of it or maybe offered to go with her, but still. I would like to give the benefit of the doubt here, though, so I'm going to play devil's advocate. This woman was being tormented and harassed for months at that point, and possibly for longer. I think it was years at this time, actually. She might have felt safer knowing her friends were around in case she needed them, and maybe thought that the stalker wouldn't come around, at least not in person, if he knew that Tom and Agnes were there. What if she was sick and tired of living in fear and of dealing with the fact that the police and now some other people thought that she had staged it all for attention or for whatever other reason, and she decided to do something normal and take her dog for a walk? If the dog needed to go out, or if that was a normal time to go to the bathroom, maybe she decided to seize that opportunity to take the dog out and feel normal for just a few moments in time. In that scenario, maybe she didn't want to stand right outside of her house, in the back or the front of her house, because then she would be like a sitting duck if her phantom stalker did decide to come along. That's just one thought I was thinking. Or maybe she had a nervous breakdown and she's just like, I don't care if this person kills me. I'm done. Like, I'm going to go out. I'm not going to live the rest of what little life I have because this person's going to murder me in fear. F him if he wants to come for me. I'm taking my dog for a walk. At this point, in hearing about her basement being lit up while she was out walking her dog at 3 a.m. with everything else that had been going on with her, I also started to think that maybe it started out as something serious, but she was desperate for the police and everyone else who doubted her to believe her so that she could finally maybe get some help and not have to live like that anymore. So while her friends were there as potential witnesses, she staged the fire for their benefit and the benefit of the people finally believing her, and it backfired on her. So what I'm saying here is maybe her plan was to stage some elaborate thing while Tom and Agnes were there to try and prove that it was actually going on, because it was. But in the end, it made her looking even more guilty herself. That's another scenario I could think of where she would have staged the fire, or why she would have been out walking her dog, and why, none of the evidence pointed to there having been an intruder. Those are the only scenarios where the basement being on fire while she walked her dog in the middle of the night makes sense to me. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about that one, though. Another scenario, though, of course, is that her phantom stalker also knew that the police, the media, and some of her friends didn't believe her. And when he saw her go so brazenly for a walk with her dog that night, he struck, knowing it would look more suspicious than anything else and lend no credibility to what she was saying and had been saying all along. In fact, this was like the final straw in the whole situation as far as anyone believing Cindy and what she was saying was being done to her. Basically, no one believed her anymore after the basement fire, probably because she was walking her dog in the middle of the night in the dark by herself after allegedly enduring all of this, and knowing someone is trying to kill her made no sense to most people. But as someone who has endured the pain of living in constant fear and anxiety, wondering what torture I would have to endure next, I have to somewhat defend her actions. Keep in mind, Gemstones, I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm just giving you my thoughts about my experiences and how it pertains to Cindy's situations. Sometimes in situations like this, we don't do the most normal things. And in fact, living in a constant and perpetual state of fear and terror will make us do some bizarre things for even more bizarre reasons. For instance, when I mentioned maybe she got to the point where she just wanted some sort of control over something and didn't care because her life had become what it had at that point, and she probably figured, F it. I'm just saying we can never fully know what goes on in someone's head, and if you've never lived like that, then it should be harder for you to judge. But I definitely understand everyone else's point as well, because it is where my doubt came in too. But I don't completely doubt her for the reasons I just gave. Moving on. Even her own friend and private investigator Ozzy Caban wondered if maybe Cindy had been fabricating everything that had happened to her up to that point. She was eventually committed to a local psychiatric hospital under the suspicion that she was delusional, paranoid, and at risk for taking her own life. Cindy spent 10 weeks in that psych ward, being constantly supervised and under constant observation. While in the hospital, Cindy finally broke her silence and started talking about who she thought was her elusive phantom stalker. She said she believed wholeheartedly that it was her ex-husband, Roy Makepeace. The police were nice enough here to do their job and questioned Roy, but he adamantly denied having had anything to do with it. Roy made an astonishing confession when questioned and said that he had been receiving death threats as well, and that they were being left on his answering machine at his home. He would also tell the police that in his professional opinion, his wife was suffering from severe delusional disorder and possibly a split personality, as it was called back then as well. So she was completely delulu. And by the way, he was receiving death threats as well. See, now, that sounds suspicious to me. And don't even get me started on this guy. Why did he only come out with the alleged death threats on his answering machine when he was questioned as a person of interest in his ex-wife's stalker case? Also, had he ever professionally evaluated Cindy? If he didn't, then did he ever see anything personally while they were married that would lead him to believe in his alleged diagnosis? If so, then why hadn't he ever said anything about it until that point, and why hadn't he done anything about it either? He was a psychiatrist, and surely he could have and would have helped his own wife had she been suffering that way. I'm not saying I think that her ex-husband was the phantom stalker, but I am saying that his behavior did raise my eyebrows. Nothing he said made sense, and had the police done their jobs and actually investigated him further than asking him a few questions and making it known his wife said she thought he was the culprit, then we might have more answers to the questions I just asked, but there are no answers to those logical, very reasonable questions because the police had already made up their minds at that point, and the police had already let the public know, including Roy Makepeace, that they thought Cindy was delusional and staging all of this. So he knew, and he was a psychiatrist, he knew that they already thought it was her. I'm sure he could have easily fed them more to make them think that if it were him, if it were, I'm not saying it was because I don't know. The police were adamant, once again, that they believed Cindy had been orchestrating the whole thing all of that time, and they weren't ever going to admit that they had ever been wrong or that they made a mistake. Guys, this went on for years. On May 25th, 1989, so 6 years and 7 months after the harassment had originally begun, and believe me, it had lasted that entire time throughout all those months and years and never let up. I just only talked about the highlights here in this video, remember that. There's so much more that this woman went through. So on that date, Cindy decided to go to the local mall and do some shopping, and she stopped as well to cash a check, but she would never make it back home again. The police found her car abandoned in the mall's parking lot. Upon further investigation of the vehicle, they found blood on the driver's side door and the contents of her wallet scattered all around and underneath the vehicle. In her trunk, they found a wrapped gift she had purchased for someone and some bags of groceries she had picked up earlier that day. There was no sign of Cindy James, though, and no sign of where she could have gone to either. No one knew where she was, no one had seen her from the day she went to the mall, and her car wasn't found until 2 weeks later. Cindy was found dead in the front yard of an abandoned house in that area. Her hands and feet had been tightly bound behind her back, and a black nylon stocking had been tightly bound around her neck too. Her body was once again covered in scratches and bruises from head to toe, and there was a very obvious needle mark in her arm. An autopsy found that she had been drugged with a large dose of morphine and had died from a combination of an overdose and asphyxiation due to the stocking around her neck. The next part is quite unbelievable, so please brace yourselves. Authorities immediately, within seconds to a minute, concluded that Cindy James's death was a suicide, and without any further investigation into what possibly could have happened, they confidently deemed and determined that she had taken her own life in this very bizarre and horrific way. This was all despite the fact that her hands and feet had been bound behind her back. She had been drugged, and she had been found in a very well-populated area where she definitely would have been found right away. She would have been seen. 2 weeks had passed by since she had allegedly laid there in the front yard and taken her own life. There was a lot of passing foot traffic in the area where Cindy had been found, and to most people with common sense, but not to the police, of course, her body had definitely been dumped there. There was also no needle found at the scene. So, if she had taken a large enough dose of morphine that she overdosed, and that overdose was so great that it contributed to her death, where did the needle go? It was obvious the drugs had been administered one way or the other with the needle because of the obvious needle mark on her arm that by all accounts hadn't been there before her disappearance. Despite all of the factors that contribute to her death being a homicide, the police said she had a psychotic break and she had taken her own life. Case closed. Nothing to see here, folks. Her family filed final cause of death ludicrous, obviously. And Cindy's dad, a man named Otto James, said about it all, quote, "The police did not investigate the possibility of a homicide, of somebody murdering her, but zeroed in on trying to prove that she committed suicide. There is no way she could have been able, after ingesting that amount of drugs, to tie herself up. There was absolutely nothing at that crime scene to indicate that she had used any form of syringe or she had used any drinking device or anything of that nature," end quote. This is yet another case where the police needed to make the evidence fit their ridiculous narrative instead of the other way around and using common sense to make a final determination. I usually go easy on the police here, guys, but between this one and Aaron Valenti last week, I don't know how I can possibly be easy with them now. Not in these two cases. Unfortunately, both of Cindy's parents are now deceased, and though people say they died without ever obtaining what they were seeking and that they desperately searched for answers as to what happened to their beloved daughter, I know that they were reunited and they're at peace now. I'm sorry if some of you don't like that I say things like that, but let's call it my opinion, which I, like everyone else, am entitled to. This case is frustrating because that's literally it. There's nothing else. We're left with nothing but confusion and more questions, not to mention disappointment and anger at the shoddy police work being done in this case. Who would want to target this unassuming and otherwise perfectly normal woman like they did? Why in the world were the authorities so convinced that she was making it all up that they flat out refused to investigate any further? They never told anyone why they thought that she had made it all up. And I think if they would have just explained their reasoning, it could have helped the rest of us to understand. However, they won't, because they can't flat out admit that they made a mistake because they can be sued, or at least that's my opinion why they won't do it. And it's very rare for cops to admit they messed up a case or that they made mistakes. Don't get me wrong, it does happen. Rarely, but it didn't and more than likely won't happen in this case. We'll probably never get the answers we seek here, and that's really unfortunate. The only thing we know for sure is that this perfectly normal and seemingly friendly and kind woman fell victim to something dark and deadly, and no one would listen to her when she tried to reach out for help. I don't personally believe Cindy took her own life, but I do believe something was going on that she wasn't telling anyone, and maybe, just maybe, the initial phone calls plus the divorce did cause her to have some sort of psychotic break. It's doubtful in my opinion, but anything is possible, as we know. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me, and if you enjoyed hanging out with one another if you watched in the premiere. Spread the love by sharing this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure your notification bell is set to all videos so you get notified of everything that I do here on this channel, including live streams, community post updates. In the description box, you will find important links. Every single one of my books, including my new book, Gone: Mysterious Disappearances, on Kindle, paperback, and Audible. You can find those on Amazon. I am filming this on Wednesday, the Wednesday before you guys will be watching it, or the Wednesday before it premieres, and we just went to #1 on Kindle today. So I'm super excited. Thank you guys so much for that. All of the listings for the links for my other books are also in the description box. If you want an autographed copy of any of my books, please email me, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. That information is in the description box as well. Please consider donating to the channel. PayPal, Cash App, Amazon wish list gift link. I offer personal intuitive oracle readings of all lengths in all ways, surrounding all things. So meaning I can do it through video for an hour, hour and a half, up to 2 hours. You can ask questions, or I can do it generally. You can be there through video or not be there, and I could just do a regular general. They're all different prices depending on what you need from me. I also read tarot, which I think not many of you might know about. But if you need services, if you're wondering what it is I'm all about, if you want an autographed copy of a book, if you want to send in your own personal encounters for my listener encounter series, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Also in the description box, you will find the schedule. Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, Afternoon Talk, myself, Ghost Dragon ZW, and Ryan Paul Tremblay. Wednesday nights at 10 p.m., Ghost Dragon ZW does chill and chat. Ryan's there with them a lot. He likes to have some guests on. If y'all ever want to be a part of that, email me or him. Every other Thursday, Living Paranormally with Paranormal Pixie at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Friday night at 7:15 p.m. Eastern Time, myself and Ghost Dragon ZW with live intuitive oracle. And then Saturday nights at midnight Eastern Time, Ghost Dragon ZW does replays of my old videos and hangs out with you all. So lots of live streams. Please continue to support the shorts. I do put a lot of time into those little 5-second, 22-second, 40-second, up to 60-second posts. And I just feel like it's a minute of your time, guys, just to do it for me. If you don't know what to comment under my videos, in the live streams, in the chats even, or in the comments of the shorts, just give a heart, give a gemstone, leave an emoji. It doesn't matter as long as the comment is there. It really doesn't matter what it says. Also, if you purchased any of my books, specifically Gone, Mysterious Disappearances, the newest one, please at the very least go to Amazon and rate it 5 stars. This stops people that don't particularly like me, Karens and trolls, from being able to go and give me a bad review just to troll me. The more good reviews I have out there, the better. All right. So guys, I usually ramble a lot, but really not feeling it today. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know again what you all think in the comments. Check out the description box. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're amazing. You got this. Abundance is your birthright. Just do whatever you can to try to focus on the positive and on the blessings you do have, and the universe will reciprocate that energy and bounce it right back to you. I know it's hard. Trust me. I'm not judging or indicting. I'm just letting y'all know what I'm trying to do myself too, because after all, we are all only human. I believe in you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.